Welcome to Fantastic Frameworks for Fast, Feature-Filled Flows. My name is Evan Ponter. This is Salesforce Apex Hours. I'm an independent Salesforce consultant based in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find me on Twitter at RealEvanPonter or shoot me an email, evan@pontersolutions.com. Today we're talking all about Salesforce flows. Specifically, I want to focus in on record-triggered flows. This is automation that occurs when a record is created or edited in the database, and it's going to be Salesforce's only tool for declarative automation that they focus on moving forward. There have been a lot of announcements and buzz around workflow rules and process builder slowly being retired and phased out. So I wanted to put together this session to really emphasize a couple different topics that will help as you're making that transition from workflow rules and process builder over to the flow engine, and really walk through some various scenarios that you will likely encounter as you're setting up automation in the system, and cover some best practices, tips and tricks that have really helped me streamline these operations, make sure that things will scale as you're adding more and more complex automation to your configuration, and just really be on the lookout for a couple things that might trip you up. So I'm trying to help steer people in a positive direction to set up all these record trigger flows. Now, to go through these examples, I have a couple different scenarios that really highlight various types of solutions you'll likely be solving, and I'll cover all the tips and tricks along the way. So the first scenario we're going to be covering is an update that applies a same record update. What I mean by that is you are either creating a record or you're editing a record, and the automation you want to run is simply updating a field on that same record that triggered the automation. This scenario I'm going to walk through is an opportunity naming convention. So in my fictitious org, this sales team has sales reps creating opportunities all the time, and they'd really like to standardize the name that's put into the opportunity name field. They'd like to pull in the account name, the close date, and the amount automatically. And anytime those key pieces of information are updated, they want the name of the record to reflect those updates. We can use record triggered flows to solve for this. So I'm going to jump into the org here and show you a very simple record triggered flow. And we're going to go through everything step by step at first, and we'll speed up as we go through these examples. So the first thing to note is I'm working with a record triggered flow. In the start element, there's a number of settings to make sure are correct. We want to run this automation on a specific object. So for our scenario, it's the opportunity object. We want this automation to run anytime a record is created or updated. So I'm going to choose that option here for the trigger. Next thing I want to cover is down at the bottom here is the way we optimize our flow. We can either run it optimized for fast field updates, which translates to a before save flow, which is the same as a trigger that runs in before context. The other option you have here is actions and related records, which is a flow trigger that runs in after save context. Now the difference between these two, the fast field updates that runs before save, it's really good at setting values on the triggering record. In fact, that is the one use case where you always want to be using fast field updates for these flows that run before save. Any other type of automation you might want to kick off, whether it's updating another record, creating another record, deleting records, kicking off an email alert, sending a chatter post, you name it. Anything else that is not a same record field update, you're going to take care of using the actions and related records in that after save context. For our scenario today, we are simply updating the name on the opportunity anytime it's created or changed, so we'll use the fast field updates option. Once we've selected that, it really helps determine how the entry conditions behaves. I'm a big fan of setting entry conditions to really narrow down scenarios where your flow runs. Most efficient flow is the one that does not run at all. So what we want to do here is make sure our flow only runs in situations where it's absolutely necessary to run. You don't need this flow kicking off every time other changes are made to the opportunity record. We really only need it to run when a record is first created and if any three key pieces of information are updated. So that's exactly what I've set up here. I'm using OR conditions so I can check for multiple scenarios, and if any one of them is true, I want this flow to run. First scenario is when a record is brand new. The way we can check for that in our entry conditions is by checking to see if the ID field is null. If that's true, we know we're working with a brand new record. Now, the reason for this is because we're running this flow before the record is committed to the database. So at that point, if the ID field does not have a value because it hasn't been assigned yet, that doesn't happen until a record's actually committed to the database. We check that ID field and it is null, we know this is a brand new record. And that's a scenario where we want this flow to run. That's why I have this first one set up. The other three conditions are pretty simple. It's anytime the account is changed, the amount is changed, or the close date is changed. Those are the three pieces of information in the opportunity naming convention, and we want to make our update anytime any one of those is changed. Once we have all of that set up, the only other element we need on our flow canvas is a way to set values on the triggering record. Now, really, there are two ways to do this. You can use an assignment element. You may be familiar with that. That might make a lot of sense to you if you're coming from the Apex world. Salesforce recently allowed for the update records element. I'm going to say that in air quotes. The update records element can be placed on the canvas in a before save flow context. Now what's happening here is they've locked it down to only allow you to update the record that triggered the flow. And what they're doing behind the scenes is they're translating this to an assignment. I think the reason they brought this to the flow canvas is to make it very obvious for admins who might not be familiar with Apex that assignments you apply here are going to be committed to the database. It just so happens they're being committed in the DML operation that is already taking place. You are simply assigning values to the record, and then it continues on and gets committed to the database in the save operation. You can set additional filter conditions here if you choose. I have already set very strict entry conditions for the flow to run in the first place. So if we do want to run the flow, I do want to go ahead and execute the only element on the canvas, which is this quote unquote update records element, which is really just assigning values to the triggering record. And the only assignment I'm making is setting the value in the name field. Now I'm going to use a formula to set that value. Pro tip number one is formulas are incredibly powerful in record triggered flows. They can apply logic that you can do with a regular formula field, and it gives you a lot more space to define those conditions and what those values should be rather than trying to hard code it here in this value field. So I end up using a formula resource, which you'll see over here in the toolbox panel. Under resources, you have your formulas. If you ever create a new resource, you can choose a formula right from those options. Now, this name value formula is setting our naming convention. And there's a couple tips and things I want to highlight in here. First thing is we wanted to pull in the name of the related account for our naming convention. And I'm using an if statement here in order to set that value to what it should be. When we're working with relationship fields in record triggered flows, because I'm trying to pull in the name of the related account, I need to traverse a relationship. Now, we have ways to access values from the triggering record from this $record global variable. This gives you the ability to choose any field value from the triggering record. If you wanted to traverse a relationship like we're doing here and picking the name from the account, we can easily do that. All of the relationship fields have this little caret that lets you know you can traverse that relationship. Once I've traversed account, I can find the name field and enter that. One thing you want to do is you want to make sure your relationship fields have values before you attempt to traverse them. During flow runtime, if you have attempted to traverse a relationship field that does not have a value, an error will be thrown. It could be an unhandled fault, and it's a nasty red error message. So to do that, I'm using this if statement to make sure that an account is specified. If so, I go ahead and traverse that relationship and grab the account name. If there is no account specified, I can put in some static text here for unknown account. Now, the next thing I'm doing is I'm using a pipe to break up the different text in the naming convention. So it looks like the requirement that we have here, where there's pipe characters in between. After that, I am putting in the close date. Now that's a date data type. So if you want to insert it into a text field, you're going to have to wrap it in a text function. The only reason I bring all that up is to say that before winter 2023, there was no formula editor here. So you had to know all of your functions and formulas that you can work with from the documentation. All of those will run in this formula builder in the flow engine, the flow canvas here. Just make sure you are converting things to the proper data type. Last piece of information needed was the amount from the record. So as long as it has a value, I'm going to go ahead and put another pipe delimiter, and then the rest of this is really just formatting that amount field to look like US currency. Currency values are stored in the Salesforce database as plain numbers. They might not have decimal places at all. They might be rounded off to just a single decimal place. So if you want things to show up with the currency symbols, commas, and the decimal points in the proper places, you will have to parse that data yourself. There are lots of examples on the Trailblazer community of displaying currency in the proper locale formatting. Just Google or search in the Trailblazer community for the currency you are interested in, and they will help you get that formatting correct. Point of all this is to show that there's a lot of logic that you can run in these flow formulas, and that really sets us up for everything else we're doing, working with these flow formulas to set values and make decisions at the right time. So I'm going to go ahead and activate this version of the flow and show you how it works. So let's activate this. I will jump over into an org over here, and I'm going to create a brand new opportunity for this Burlington Textiles account, and we will see that opportunity naming convention gets applied. So I'm going to enter an amount. Let's say it's $500 and it closes at the end of September. I choose a stage. Now, as soon as I click save, my flow is going to run. It's going to apply that naming convention and then commit the record to the database. It happens so fast that even the post message includes the naming convention that we've applied. If we navigate to the record, we see we have our account name, our close date, and our amount. If any of those pieces of information change, let's say I missed a zero here, and this should actually be $10,000, and the close date gets pushed out to the end of October. As soon as I click save, those edits are applied to the name of the record here. Now we have two options for setting up automation that updates a field on the record. What I've just shown you is a way to update a field and allow for custom changes to be made here. So if somebody wanted to tweak the name of this with a custom label at the end, they are able to save those changes. If you wanted, you could not allow for these customizations to be made, and you could have a standard field like the opportunity name behave like a formula. If you're interested in that, all you would need to do is edit your entry conditions in your record triggered flow to also watch for changes to the name field. So if I set this up to also check to see if the name has changed, then people would not be able to commit changes to that name field. This flow would run, it would apply the naming convention and overwrite their changes with the name that we want it to have. So this comes up and comes in handy anytime you need to have a standard field or maybe a pick list field, but you need it to have its value determined programmatically. You can use a record triggered flow and you can enforce that the logic that you want to run is always run, and people cannot override it. Now, the next scenario is gonna take a look at a couple different things that you might want to think about as you're doing automation. So I showed you how we were able to access values from the triggering record. We're able to traverse relationships. In fact, you can traverse up to 10 levels of relationships without ever running a query. And the fewer queries you need to run in your automation, the faster your automation is going to run. So definitely take advantage of that $ record global variable and the ability to traverse those relationships. Just be mindful to check each relationship to make sure it has a value before you attempt to traverse it. For this next scenario, we're going to try to get some information that we don't have access to from the triggering record or any of its parents in its hierarchy. So the scenario is when an opportunity is created, the account already has an open opportunity. We want to set some text in the next step field. What's happening here is this sales team is constantly creating opportunity records, which is great, but the operations team would really love to consolidate those shipments into fewer shipments. So if there are already open opportunities on the account, they wanted to gather up all of those opportunities and have it make one shipment. We want to put some text in the next step field on a brand new opportunity that says, check if these products can be delivered at the same time as this existing opportunity, and then post a link to the record. Now, we don't have access to just the next open opportunity on the account by traversing relationships, so we will need to run a query, and if we find results, we want to put this text in the next step field. So let me show you how that would work. I'm going to use the same opportunity before save flow we were just looking at earlier. This is another example where we're simply updating a field on the triggering record. So I want to run this in before save context so I can be as efficient as possible with my declarative automation. Let's take a look at the start element. We are running this automation on opportunity anytime it's created or updated. For our new scenario, we need to run this check when an opportunity is created. Now, we are already running this flow when an opportunity record is first inserted into the database. This before save flow is evaluated before the record's committed, so it doesn't have an ID in that instance. So this entry conditions is already set up for our scenario. We don't need to make any changes here. We do need to make changes to is what happens on the canvas. So that quote unquote update records that we had before, assigning values to the triggering opportunity, that's still here at the bottom. Before we get to that, we need to query for the next open opportunity on the account. Now, what I like to do before I run a query, I'm going to have multiple scenarios handled by a single flow, is I use a decision to determine if I need to run that query or not. Decisions I'm using here really help me make my flows efficient when they are evaluated at runtime, and they protect expensive elements so that they only run when they absolutely need to. So this decision is checking, do I need to check for an open opportunity? What I'm doing here is I've set up a formula resource that returns a Boolean value, true or false. And I called it need to check for open opportunity. If that's true, I'm going to route down the left side of this decision. This need to check for open opportunity is just some really simple logic here. Is this a brand new record? And is there a value in the account field? Those are the two things I need to be true before I perform this query, this get records. Now, the reason I put this in a formula instead of just putting it into the decision is the formulas can be referenced in multiple places in your flow. It's a really good way to consolidate your logic so you're not constantly repeating yourself. Really good programming principle is don't repeat yourself. So by using these formula resources, you can maintain your logic for any given decision you might want to make in a single place and just reference it multiple times. So I'll show you where this need to check for open opportunity comes up again a little bit later. So if that's true and I route down the left side of this outcome path, I'm going to go to this get records element. This is a query that's searching for records in the database. What's happening here is I want to find an opportunity record, and I can set some conditions here. Find me an opportunity where the account ID equals the value of the triggering records account. So it's saying find an opportunity underneath the same account. I want to make sure it's an open opportunity, so I have a condition here to check that is closed equals false. Now, since I need the very next open opportunity under the account, I'm going to sort my records ascending by close date, so I get the earliest close date. And I really only want the first record. That's, I need a link to this record, so I only need the first one. I don't need all of them if there are multiple. And down here at the bottom is a trick I like to use when I only need a couple pieces of information from the record I'm searching for. And instead of storing all the values automatically in a record variable and then needing to use a decision to check if there are results in that variable, and then going ahead and accessing those results in a third step on the flow canvas, I found that storing the pieces of information you need in plain variables in the flow allows you to safely reference those variables later without having to add extra decision elements to your canvas. Keeping your canvas as clean as possible will allow your flow to run as fast as possible. Think about scenarios where you might need to be processing hundreds of records at the same time. Flow is really good at batching up those processes and evaluating records in bulk. What ends up happening is things like decisions and assignments, they end up needing to be bulkified and processed, and that just takes a little bit more time. So the fewer things you have on the canvas, the less your flow needs to think about all those bulkification scenarios. And this is one of the ways I've found can eliminate some of the bloat there. So I'm going to go ahead and store just the ID from the record I found in a variable, text variable called Open Opportunity ID. And then the next thing I do on the canvas is I route to this quote unquote update records element. It's really just assigning values to the triggering record. And I have both fields from our two scenarios being assigned values using formulas. And this is where things get really interesting. It's not always that we need to apply our naming convention and we need to set this next step field. These things might need to happen independently. And the way we can set things independently is by using some formula logic on the value side here to set the value of the fields we're assigning. So for this next step field, I'm assigning it to the value from this next step value formula. I'll show you what that looks like. I have an if statement here. Now this seems really simple, but it's really important to understand what I'm doing. This if statement allows me to conditionally set values in this field. First part here is the conditions for when I want my automation to run. First thing I'm doing is saying, hey, did I run that query to check for the open opportunity? Notice I'm referencing that same Boolean formula resource from earlier. And that allows me to consolidate my logic here and make sure that I did in fact go run that query to find an open opportunity. If I ran that query and there's a value in that open opportunity text field, which I can safely reference here whether or not it has a result or not. It's okay if this text field is null. It's not going to throw a runtime error when my flow gets evaluated. If both of those things are true, here's where I'm setting that static text. Check if these products can be delivered at the same time. And then I wanted to put a link to that record. This is another really cool tip, is instead of hard coding the first part of the domain for a link to a record, you can actually generate that URL dynamically. I'm working in a Trailhead playground here, and the domain is Wise Otter, and there's a bunch of letters and numbers, and I don't want to have to remember that or hard code it into my URL here. This also helps if you're moving functionality from sandbox to production, and you don't want to constantly update your URLs. There's a global variable available in Flow called $API, and it really just has this enterprise server URL followed by 3 numbers. 3 numbers are just corresponding to the API version that your instance is currently on. If we scroll down here to the bottom, there's enterprise server URL 550. That really just corresponds to summer of 2022. When winter 23 comes out, you'll see enterprise server URL 560.0. That gives you a URL for your current instance. All you need to do is parse it a little bit and find where the .com/ is, take everything up to that point, and then tack on a record ID. If you put a record ID after everything in the URL up to the .com/, you will have a dynamic URL to that record. It works in Classic and it works in Lightning. It'll just get redirected to the Lightning URL. So that's the automation we want to run when those conditions are true. Now my else statement is very interesting. If those conditions are not true, I want to set the next step field to the value that it already has. Now why would I do that? If you set a field to the value it already has in before save context, it results in no change being made. This is how you can independently apply new values to fields within a single update records element, a single assignment element on the canvas. This is really the heart of what makes this framework so powerful is you can assign values to a bunch of different fields on your triggering record using a single update records element and have the value determined independently based on whatever logic you need to run for your business requirements, your use case. Put that logic into a formula resource, and it allows you to independently evaluate those conditions and set new values. If you don't need to automate the field, then set the field equal to the value it already has. This can get elaborate. You can do as many field assignments here as you need to. Now let's go ahead and activate this version, and I'll show you how this version solves for both of our requirements. So I'll flip back over here to this Burlington Textiles account. I'm going to go ahead and create another new opportunity here. Set some values in all the required fields. Put this for October 20th, qualification, and I'll set an amount. Now, as soon as I click save, my naming convention is applied. See that show up in the toast message. If I navigate to that record, because this is a new opportunity on an account that already has open opportunities, I see my next step field gets set with that dynamic link to the record. Now, I can make updates to the amount field. My naming convention still applies that logic. My next step field did not need to be set again, so nothing got changed there. And that's the power of having those if statements and formulas that set the values of fields so that you can independently evaluate when you want automation to run. There's a ton you can do with this framework. This is the entire flow canvas here. If you need to run other queries before you get to your single update records element, you can add another decision and another query. Your before save flows tend to be simple because their capabilities are limited. You are really only solving scenarios where you're updating fields on the same record that triggered the flow. So a lot of your canvases might be just a single element like this one, or you might have to run a few queries and then route to your update records element at the end. For the rest of our scenarios, we are going to be looking at other automation that does not involve simply updating a field on the same record. Our next scenario is going to be about creating multiple records. So for this, the account managers want to set the customer priority field to high on select accounts, and they want two things to happen for their sales reps on their team. They want them to review the account today, and they want a task created for that. And then they want another task created to have that rep call the client with tomorrow's due date. So this is an update that a sales manager will make to an account record, and then two tasks should be. We can use record triggered flows to do this. We are going to need to use after save context in order to have the ability to create new records. Let's take a look at this one step by step. First thing we'll note is we want to run this automation on the account object whenever a record is updated. At the bottom here, I've optimized this flow for actions and related records so that I can do those create record actions. For the entry conditions, we still only want this to run in very specific scenarios. I really only want this to run when customer priority is equal to high and the record has been updated to meet those conditions. This really narrows that window when this flow will run. We're going to be creating two tasks. We could do that as two separate create records elements, but that is going to be inefficient because that would call two DML statements to create each of those records independently. What we can do instead is we can use collections to help us make this more efficient. The same way you would do this in Apex, you can facilitate adding record variables to a collection in Flow. The way we do that is with assignments. So the first thing we'll do is we can set up single record variables. I've set up task 1 and task 2. The way you do that is under your resource types, when you set up a variable, you can choose a data type, and I've chosen record, and then you select which object you want to create a record variable for. So I've set up record variables for task 1 and task 2, and then I set up a record collection variable. Almost exactly the same way. You set up a variable, you choose record, you choose your object, but over here is you can allow multiple values for this variable, and this turns it into a collection variable. I don't have any inputs or outputs set up on any of that. These are all things that are happening in Flow memory. Your yellow elements here are all logic that is happening inside of Flow memory. It's much more efficient to process things in Flow memory rather than doing a bunch of these pink elements, which are database operations. They're either creating records, updating, deleting, or performing queries, which will retrieve records from the database. Those pink elements are expensive. We want to keep those to a minimum, which is why we're going to be using a collection here to define the records we want, add them to a collection, and then create them all at the same time. Our first assignment element is assigning values to each of those task record variables. I can use any value from the $record global variable. I have access to some Flow global variables as far as getting the current date. You can use formulas to set these values. There's really a lot of flexibility. And one thing I am doing to help keep things consolidated, I went ahead and assigned values to the fields in task 1 for that first task of reviewing the account with today's due date. In the same assignment element, I go ahead and assign values to task 2, that second record variable that I set up earlier. This has all the values to say call the client with tomorrow's due date, which I used a formula to set. Now, once I've set up all those assignments, keep in mind that the Flow engine at runtime may run these assignments in a very random order. It will take care of all the assignments in a single element before it moves on to the next one. For our purposes, really doesn't matter to me if the due date gets assigned before the priority or vice versa. So that's fine for those to happen in random order. But what I want to do is make sure all those assignments are taken care of first before I add those tasks to the collection so that the collection holds the values that I need it to have. So I have a second assignment element that happens next where I'm simply taking that task to create collection variable and adding each of my task record variables to it. I can go ahead and do both of those additions in the same assignment element just to get those records into the collection here. Once I have that set up, then the third step here is to create the tasks. You have the option to create multiple records, and that will let you choose your record collection. Let's activate this version and show you how it works. So I'll flip back over here to an account. As a sales manager, I'm going to change the customer priority from low to high. And as soon as I click save, you'll see those task records get created. Super quick, super efficient, with the proper values to review the account today and call the client tomorrow. Now, the last scenario we have here is when we need to update multiple records. For this scenario, the sales team was tired of when they had an account that went inactive, they would have to go update the stage of all the open opportunities to close lost manually. How much of a pain is that? Really would love some automation to help them do that more efficiently. So anytime the account's active field is set to no, they want to automatically have the stage of all the open opportunities on that account be set to closed lost. We can use our record triggered flows to solve for this scenario. Here's my account after save flow with a few updates being made. I am going to accomplish both of these requirements in the same flow. If you do choose to use that framework, there's a lot of debate about this. I still need to do some testing to really determine what's the best configuration here. For right now, as things are simple, I believe it is much easier to keep one flow per object per trigger context until things get more complicated or warrant separate flows. If you do choose the separate flow situation, it's going to be more efficient to have mutually exclusive entry conditions, so only one flow is running at a time. Nothing, well, I did have to change a few things in my start element. So this is still running on account. It's only when an account is updated. I am checking for changes to two different fields here. So I want this flow to run if customer priority is changed or the active field is changed. That will help make sure this flow runs for both of my scenarios. This is still actions and related records optimized so that I can accomplish all those wonderful actions. I do not encourage anybody to apply a same record update in your actions and related records flow that runs after save. Sort of defeats the whole purpose of having these two flavors of flow. So once I have this set up, I'm going to start using decisions here to determine which set of actions I want to execute. This looks a lot like a process builder canvas where you would have a decision. That's true, execute those actions. If not, then evaluate the next decision. If that's true, carry out those actions, so on and so forth. This first decision is seeing if I need to create tasks. So here's where I'm checking, did customer priority, does it equal high right now? And did it get updated to now meet those requirements? Basically the same thing I had in the previous versions, entry conditions in the start element. I've moved that into a decision. So I'm looking for multiple things when this flow runs. So if those tasks are needed, I route to the left side and I evaluate those same three elements we just looked at. If I don't need tasks, I skip that completely, and I come down here to solve for my new requirement. Do opportunities need to be closed? In this decision, I'm checking that active field to see if it equals no, and did the record get updated to now meet those conditions? Basically, was the active field changed from some other value to no? If that's true, and I wrote down the left side to this update opportunities element. And I want to highlight a few things. This looks really simple and might be straightforward. There's actually a ton of things happening in this element on your behalf, which is great news that Salesforce is going to optimize these actions on their own behind the scenes at scale for all of their customers. So whenever you use this option to specify conditions to identify records and set fields individually, there's about 5 things happening you should be aware of. First thing that's happening is a query is being run. It will always be run. Doesn't matter what your conditions are, it's going to run a query. So be mindful of that. This is going to be a query on the opportunity object. It's going to find records that meet these conditions. The account ID is the same as the triggering record. Is closed equals false. That's helping me find all the open opportunities under this account. Next thing that's happening is it's going to loop through all of those results and apply this assignment. It's going to set stage name equal to closed lost for all of the results that found in that query. It's going to add all those records to a new collection to prepare it to be committed to the database. And then finally, it applies that DML update action for all of those records. This is great news if you have a scenario like what I've laid out here where you want to update a bunch of records. Instead of you having to perform that query as a get records and setting up a loop and looping through and assigning new values and adding to a new collection and committing to the database after the fact in a separate element, let Salesforce optimize that for you by using this specify conditions option for your update records element. Now, things are not always this simple. So I can show you how this works. Let me activate it real quick and show you what happens if I come over to an account and I set active to no. I have a bunch of open opportunities in prospecting and qualification. As soon as I click save, my flow will perform those actions and set all those open opportunities to closed lost. This is great news. But what happens when things get a little bit more complicated? And you might have scenarios where you need to set new values on the results of a query, but you need to evaluate each record as you're going through. Something like that might be what I've laid out here. Um, Same scenario we had before where if the active is changed to no, I'm going to root down this left side. I query for all my open opportunities. I loop through them. So this is looping through my opportunities collection variable. But when I'm assigning values, I can set the stage name equal to a formula. And in that formula for stage value, I can make some decisions referencing each opportunity record in those results. So let's say I wanted to set a different stage depending on what the probability is. I can check the probability on each opportunity record and apply a new stage value dependent on its probability. To do something like this, you do need to split out all of those actions into your own query, your loop, your assignment. You need to add all the records to a new collection so that you can commit them to the database. That's what I'm doing in this step. And then outside of the loop, you want to update your opportunities. And keep in mind, I'm not using the third option here. I'm using the second one where I can use the IDs from a record collection, and then I can apply those updates all at the same time. Main thing I want to emphasize here is if you already have the IDs of the records you hope to update, use this second option so that you can reference a record collection or a single record variable to apply that update. Anytime you use this third option, a query is going to run, so don't specify conditions and then simply say, find me a record that equals this ID I already have. That's running a query unnecessarily. This first option, I feel like should not even be an option in after save flows. We don't want to update the triggering record in after save context because it's way more efficient to do that in before save context. So keep all of your same record updates contained in your before save flow for that object. This is a lot of information I know I'm throwing at you, so I do want to summarize everything we've talked about today. Here are all the points about flows that are optimized for fast field updates. These are before save flows. We want to use entry conditions to make sure our flows only run when they absolutely need to. You want to protect your queries using decision elements. So you're only routing to elements on your flow canvas when they need to be run. Otherwise, you can skip them. Query for records and store the information you need in plain variables. This allows you to safely reference those variables at any point later in your flow, and you'll never have to worry about null record variables that might throw errors. So keep that in mind so you can eliminate some decisions and processing from your flow canvas. I like to use a single update records element at the end of my fast field updates flow just to consolidate that operation. There is a bulkification happening behind the scenes. If you are processing hundreds of records, you can keep that to a minimum by using this single update records element. So it only has to loop through all of your records one time. Then the value that's being applied is conditional by using formula resources so that you can make decisions independently. These formula resources also allow you to reuse your logic in multiple places, which makes you much more efficient so you don't have to keep repeating yourself. Last slide here is flows that are optimized for actions and related records. These are running in after save context. A lot of the same principles as before. We want to use entry conditions so that our flow only runs when it absolutely needs to. We protect our actions using decisions and help route flows to the set of actions that need to be executed for any given scenario. We want to consolidate our database operations, again, keeping those pink elements to a minimum by using the yellow or orange elements to do some flow logic in memory. Here we are assigning values to record variables, adding them to a collection, and then we create them all in one DML operation. Last thing is use the query and update in a single element whenever possible. That's that option to specify conditions and let Salesforce handle optimizing that query and loop and reassignment of values for you. If you do need to query for records independently, make sure that you use a record collection to update the new values instead of doing a query all over again. So just be mindful of that update records element has a few different options, and that third one will always run a query. Thank you so much for your time and watching this. You can follow Apex Hours at hashtag Salesforce Apex Hours, or follow them at Apex Hours. Here are their websites and LinkedIn. There's a bit.ly to the YouTube in order to see other videos from Salesforce Apex Hours. Thank you so much. My name is Evan Ponter. You can find me on Twitter at RealEvanPonter, and hope to see you on another video very soon. Thanks so much.